feel
Yeah,
like
I
a
was
bit of a
wondering,
nerd.
Rachel, I don't know if I seen you in glasses before.
Probably not. I gave up on wearing them for like 2 to 3 years, and, yeah, my eyesight got a lot worse in that time.
Do you wear contacts at all or no?
No, no, I never really had, like they were really minor prescription, and then all of a sudden, I started getting all these headaches, and I, like, noticed I was, like, squinting to see the clock when it was a few feet away, and, I put them on, and I was like, "Oh, that's what that's supposed to look like." So, I think I am at the point now where they might become, like, a regular occurrence, but they were basically just something I would wear, like, here and there before.
I've heard
Uh,
like falling asleep with contacts is like the worst thing.
Yeah, they seem like a huge pain, and then when you travel, you've gotta, like, bring all that extra stuff, so I think I'll just stick with the glasses frames.
I've noticed a similar decline in my vision since working at True North, probably because I'm staring at a screen all day. So that's a casualty of war. We're putting our bodies on the line out here at True North.
Yeah, you
Cosmin,
get
the mug
yeah.
is a much better fit for you whenever I drink it, that you can't see the logo
Mm.
because it's backwards. Look,
I
it just
know.
looks like a plain mug. We need to talk to management about this. We
Yeah,
need the label on both sides.
I think William's to blame for that.
I mean, most people are right-handed, so it does seem like quite the oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna have start having two mugs, lefties and righties.
Or
Anyways,
you could just put it on both sides, but
let's hop into our first story here.
so I guess, I mean, we've all been following the trade war that's breaking out between Canada and the United States. I feel like as soon as I put out content on this, it immediately becomes out of date because there's like constant new announcements. I think we probably all felt that way on Inauguration Day. Like the day before, everyone was talking about the tariffs were coming, and we saw all these op-eds about all the were coming into effect. And then first thing on Inauguration Day, I guess that was Monday morning. Oh, we hear the tariffs aren't coming, and now people are writing op-eds about how, Danielle Smith won and there was not going to be any tariffs, or there was like the counterpoint that we were not getting the tariff despite Danielle Smith not having a Team Canada approach. And then a few hours later in the day, oh, we are still getting the tariffs. They've just been delayed to February 1st. And it's basically just been a really transient story. Yesterday, I had a guest on my show, The Rachel Parker Show. You guys should all go watch it if you haven't seen it. Who actually was at the inauguration, a former special advisor to Jason Kenney, and he has a number of contacts in DC, including people headed into the Trump administration. And, he was on the ground. He was getting a feel for what everyone was saying. And seems like, from what he's heard, Danielle Smith has been very well received there. And the Americans have noticed her efforts to work with Donald Trump and with the Republicans to get a deal for Canada. And she's actually pretty respected for being there, because in contrast, Justin Trudeau and the federal government really should have been there. They should have at least had some representatives at the inauguration trying to secure meetings with Republicans to advocate for Canada and to show excitement for the new American administration to have, our voices, Canadian voices, heard at the table. They were noticeably absent. We know that Justin Trudeau had his last caucus retreat. Just a final last gift of the bill to taxpayers for a luxury retreat for him and his staff, the type that an average Canadian would never get to experience. And so what I heard was that Danielle Smith was well received, but the federal government was missing in action at the table, and the Americans picked up on all of that. And so flash forward to today, Donald Trump was speaking at the World Economic Forum conference that's currently happening in Davos, Switzerland. And he's basically saying, we don't need Canada. We do not need their lumber. We have our own lumber. We do not need their car parts. We can manufacture those car parts here in America. And he said, we do not need their energy. We have our own energy that we are going to produce. Take a listen to exactly what he had to say at the WF today.
One thing we're going to be demanding is we're going to be demanding respect from other nations. Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years. And it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit. We don't need them to make our cars, and they make a lot of them. We don't need their lumber because we have our own forests, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody.
So obviously this spells bad news from Canada for Canada. And I think what we're really seeing here is protectionism from Donald Trump. And we're seeing sort of a return for wanting to do things at home in the States. He does want to increase manufacturing in America to create those good American jobs. We've heard him say time and time again, and he especially said this over and over at his inauguration speech. He said this is going to be the golden age of America. And we know that something that's so important to him is putting good paychecks in the pockets of American voters. And he's planning to do that by creating jobs through manufacturing, whether it's to increase their lumber capacity. He sounds like he's even planning on increasing their energy capacity. There might be a time when they do not need as much energy from Alberta as they currently get. Now, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. Those are big projects that often require years to get built to the point where you can begin producing that energy. But we're seeing a shift in how the Americans are going about their relationship with Canada. And I don't think that Canada is really prepared to deal with that, because our economy, especially here in Alberta, and that's not necessarily the fault of the Albertans, but it is so reliant on Americans buying our products. And we have not been successful in, building those pipelines that we want across Canada. Whether that's to the east or to the north, we know that Alberta has tried and the rest of Canada has shut down, which is one of the reasons why Danielle Smith was so angry when the federal government said, if Donald Trump implements these tariffs, we're going to turn off the taps and we're not going to let that Alberta energy flow to the States. Because she said, look, Alberta's wanted to get our product to markets elsewhere in Canada, but the rest of the provinces just didn't want that. And now you're basically going to be ending our ability to produce and to create revenue for the province. So this is new information today with Donald Trump saying we don't need Canada anymore is new information. And I think there's a lot of premiers who are probably freaking out right now. Cosmin, what's your take?
Sure. You mentioned at the beginning that the news cycle is changing so rapidly. But I think it's just the legacy media is in complete panic mode. They don't have a clear head about what's going on. I think at the federal level, nobody's thinking about this situation clearly. And that's exactly what Donald Trump wants. He lobbed a grenade into Canadian politics at a perfect moment for the Americans, because the Americans have the upper hand. There's political instability at the federal level in Canada. We're facing an election. We don't have a clear leader. We have a lame duck sitting in the office of the prime minister. And now the provinces are left to deal with this mess on their own. And they're struggling to have a unified message simply because this is bringing up all of the problems we have as a nation when it comes to unification. There are clear and current issues when it comes to Western sentiments and the unfair deal that Western provinces, particularly Alberta, face at the national level.
And yeah, speaking on the lack of unification, let's call it, Cosmin, between the premiers, it really comes down, I think, to the difference in opinion and approach of Danielle Smith versus everyone else. Of course, we saw the premiers all meet with Justin Trudeau recently, and Smith refused to sign the joint statement that they all released in regard to the American tariffs. This was right before Donald Trump was sworn in. And then we've seen a recent rift, I think this was yesterday, because Trudeau said he wanted to go dollar for dollar on tariffs with the United States. And then Ontario Premier Doug Ford actually said the very same thing. But Smith, of course, was saying, yeah, the US's economy is 10 times the size of ours, and they rely much less on us than we do on them. If we try and start this war with them, we are going to be decimated. And these arguments don't even get into the fact that we need the United States for protection, not just from an economical standpoint, but from a public safety standpoint. So, I mean, just we're really in a no-win situation here, I think, with any bickering with the United States. They're like our big brother. We need them, and we, in no way, shape, or form, should be egging them on with a tariff trade war.
Yeah, Isaac, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said this is a no-win situation for Canada. And also your comments about defense. The source that I had on yesterday basically said, we're hearing time and time again from our American counterparts just how bad security is in Canada. And Canadians aren't even aware of it because it's not covered here in the legacy media. And so, I think for a lot of us, we thought, oh, there's so few illegals crossing into the States from Canada versus what they're getting from Mexico. Donald Trump can't really mean that. The tariffs, this is about something else. Well, no, actually, security is a big problem and it is a concern for them. And on the issue of retaliatory tariffs, we're talking about how this is a constantly changing news story. I mean, now Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe is saying, I don't know if I'm with the feds and with Ontario for that. So that so-called Team Canada approach that Danielle Smith and Alberta were roundly criticized for not engaging in is sort of falling apart all around us. And I don't know how the Canadian provinces are going to respond to the tariffs on February 1st, because that is in flux as we speak right now.
Well, just look, if I can jump off of that, I think the main issue is Donald Trump is treating Canada, looking at Canada as an adversary. And our federal government has given him a lot of reason to do so, particularly in the way Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, his cabinet, and other members of the Liberal government have responded to Trump and viewed Trump. But also, we haven't played nice on the trade front with the Americans. We imposed the digital services tax when no other country refused to do so. I think it's being talked about in the OECD, but nobody else imposed this tax, and we imposed it on American tech companies. The U.S. trade representative under the Biden regime kept asking the Liberal government to remove this tax. So there's plenty of reason, but I don't think Canada is the United States' adversary. China is the number one adversary when we're talking about trade. When we're talking about, they don't. It's not just unfair trade practices. China's involved in corporate and national espionage, and they're trying to steal trade secrets from the Americans. They're trying to outdo them on every front. That's the real adversary. And I think it's about repositioning Canada, and perhaps a new government might do that, as a friend to the Trump administration, as a partner instead of an adversary to attack and to essentially try to do economic damage to. And there have been a few statements by the US president. He said, look at what Canada and the United States could do together. He said that would be something, right? If these two countries combine their massive wealth, their massive, natural resources, then we would be, the greatest economic force if we just got along.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think to your point, we are being treated like an adversary because that is just how much Canada's global reputation has slipped on the stage in the last 9 years under Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, to the point that we were once seen as close allies, as good friends, as neighbors. And now we are being treated essentially like a hostile state because of just how low America's opinion has become of us under the last number of years. On Pierre Poilievre, I don't know what his relationship is with Donald Trump. I don't know what it would be should he become the next prime minister, because he stayed so quiet, perhaps wisely, on a number of these issues, like how Canada should proceed with the trade war. We know he said, I'm not the prime minister. It's not my job to respond to these issues. But I don't know what that relationship with Donald Trump would look like. And I wonder if Canada would be given more respect with Pierre Poilievre running the ship or not. What are your thoughts, Isaac?
Yeah, if I do recall, Poilievre, he did at one point call for retaliatory tariffs. But look, the Liberal Party of Canada have been very combative with Donald Trump over the last few years. In many instances, they have just been combative with him and not been kind to him at all. So not just Pierre Poilievre, but anyone with a clean slate, you would assume, would have a better start than the Liberals currently do, because they have a negative relationship with Donald Trump. So you're going from the negative to at least a neutral stance. And I know Trump has commented a few times on Poilievre. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he has spoken of him publicly. So he obviously knows who he is. We've seen Trump have a good relationship with other conservative leaders in Canada, example being Danielle Smith. Of course, they're close enough because she's always in the United States negotiating on Canada's behalf at this point without a prime minister with a public mandate. But speaking of Poilievre, for our next story here, we're going to hop in to a clip that recently went viral of Poilievre, which might remind you of a certain apple munching clip that we saw back in the day where he challenged a reporter once again. Let's watch it now.
All right, let's go back to D.C. right now. Obviously, on his first day on the job, President Trump signed an executive order, the U.S. government only recognizing two genders, male, female. They're unchangeable. If elected as prime minister, is that something that you're going to kind of walk in line with, or what are your feelings on that executive order?
Well, I don't know. Do you have any other genders that you'd like to name?
Me personally?
Yes.
I'm just asking more so if you're in line with what he is saying. Do you agree with what he's saying? Is that something that you would be lockstep with if elected as prime minister?
Well, I'm not aware of any other genders than men and women. I mean, if you have any other that you want me to consider, you're welcome to tell me right now.
Well, there's personally, I am a man. I am as
okay.
People who say cis man.
Good,
there are people there who they say they're
me too.
Gender
I'm a
neutral.
Man. Well,
you are a man. Yes, there are people there who say they're gender neutral. Yeah, they say they're gender neutral. They're a trans person. Is that something that you would recognize here, whereas in the States, at least with their U.S. government, the way they're seeing it, there's only two?
I'm only aware of two, but I mean, if you come up with another list, then you're welcome to do that. But I'm aware of two, and as far as I'm concerned, we should have a government that just minds its own damn business and leaves people alone to make their own personal decisions. That's the kind of government I'm going to run.
And with that, the current government, they currently have passports that allow people to put on, gender neutral on their passport. Advocate groups want the government, mind you, the outgoing government, to ask the U.S., would the U.S. recognize these passports, obviously on their way out, if you are the next prime minister? Is that something that you would advocate for?
I have to be honest.
Yeah.
I have to be honest with you. I just saw your segment on homeless encampments that are popping up all over Toronto. We've got 25% of our population in poverty. Housing costs have doubled. Crime is rampaging through our streets. I just find it to be a strange priority to spend time talking about this. My priority is to give people back control of their lives, bring back Canada's promise that anyone who works hard gets a powerful paycheck and pension that buys affordable food, gas, and homes in safe neighborhoods. That's the promise we need for Canadians. If Liberals want to talk about different labels for gender that they want to put on passports in the United States, they can do that. I'm going to talk about the things that will bring home Canada's promise.
Yeah, so we saw Poilievre implement the same technique he did in the apple munching clip, where he flipped the question back onto the reporter to get a sense of where he stood. And the CP24 news reporter in this instance seemed hesitant, but we've seen Poilievre ask whether this reporter had any examples of other genders than man and women, and he was really pushing the envelope on what do you mean by other genders? I think the reporter named 2 or 3, but certainly not through the list of like 70 that some people claim there are. So yeah, what do you? We haven't really seen Poilievre engage much on the gender debate or many debates in the past, because he seems to really try and keep a neutral stance on lots of things. Maybe because he doesn't really need to get involved with them to win the subsequent election based on current polling. Yeah, what did you guys think of that clip there?
Well, I had a good chuckle at the clip. It was a very Canadian exchange, and I had to laugh at all of the posts being like, Pierre Poilievre roast mainstream media reporter when asked, if there should be more than 2 genders, because like he didn't actually roast. Like it was sort of awkward and funny exchange, and watching it, you were just so like, this is so ridiculous and so silly that we're having this conversation. But it is relevant, it is important in this year. But the fact that like we're having a conversation about how many genders there are, like if you take a moment and actually think about it, it's like so dumb that the leader of the official opposition needs to take the time and say that on national television. But really, when he was asked about it, he didn't say anything rude back to the reporter. He was just like, well, what genders would you have me add? Like it was a very simple defense, and in that sense I think very Canadian, because it wasn't rude or hostile. And so I just kind of laughed at the exchange, and I think, you know, it really caught the reporter off guard, because reporters are not typically used to being asked questions in response to their questions. And we've noticed that leaders throughout North America have started doing this to point holes in the arguments and the fallacies of the questions that they're asking in the first place. And I think that has been very effective.
Yeah, and
So, but go ahead, Cosmin.
Yeah, it just goes to show how out of touch the legacy media is that they're even asking this in the first place. Obviously, it was in response to an executive order signed by US President Donald Trump. But of all of the different news we've talked about here and the ongoing problems we have, I think this is our primary problem, is the trade stuff. Touching on anything else, the public wants to know what is going to happen. They're looking at Canada. We're going to face a recession. They want to know how we will be protected as citizens, as businesses, and as workers, and how can we move forward. But the media is out there. They're not doing anybody favors by pursuing this line. And it's ridiculous. Now is not the time for that. Now is the time to look at things objectively and with a clear head.
Yeah, Cosmin, you kind of touched on something that Poilievre said as well, which was, of course, people are going to focus on the lead, let's call it, of that interview wherein he's just asking the reporter what he actually thinks. But he also said, why are we focusing on this gender stuff when our country is in economic disarray? I think Poilievre cited 25% of Canadians live in poverty. I mean, that is a shocking number. So the legacy media focusing on this, and I think Poilievre even alluded to the fact that the Liberal Party has been focusing on these gender issues. It's just, we have much bigger concerns as Canadians.
And if I can just add, Isaac, the other thing is that's more notable about this as well is that as soon as you push back even a tiny amount, the people who believe in this gender nonsense immediately break down, because there's no rational, logical foundation for their beliefs. It's just simply based on, you know, their feelings, and they talk, you know, they will always cite human rights, etc., etc. But it's not based on reality. And I think this interview is a clear example of that. That even the most simple question of how many genders do you think exist trips people up who buy into this, because they know from, you know, their subconscious mind knows that there are only two genders. And when they try to make an argument otherwise, it's like their own brain starts to light up and have to make excuses and come up with. And it's funny that he brought up the fact that there's three. You know, he said, well, I know there's man, woman, and gender fluid. And what is that? Like, what are you talking about? Like everything out? Like, it's so not grounded in reality. And it's good that this clip brings that out, because it just goes to show people that when you are talking to people who try to bring this nonsense up, the easiest thing you can do is just push back with simple questions.
Yeah, I have to say that I actually don't think that the reporter was wrong to ask the question. It was actually a really good question. And even the fact that it's blown up now, like as a reporter, you don't want to become the story, but don't you kind of want your interviews to blow up? Don't you want to get as many eyeballs as them as possible? Don't you want a viral moment, albeit maybe you don't want to be, you know, the point of the butt of the joke in that viral moment? I would have asked Pierre Poilievre something similar. You know, Donald Trump passed this executive order. Is this something you agree with? Would you look to make such legislative changes here in Canada should you become the next prime minister? It was really, the awkwardness became in that moment when Pierre Poilievre who didn't really answer the question. He just kind of responded with what should I add? Obviously, I would have said, well, yeah, I think it's a great policy to pass. I think obviously you need to explain that there should only be two genders, and that should be federal government policy in the way that they word things. And that reporter, though, that isn't his understanding of the situation, and certainly wouldn't be his worldview. And that's when he started to get a little bit caught off guard. And then, he felt like he needed to give a defense for the others, but he didn't know who the others were. He doesn't actually know anything about the transgender movement. That was clear. So he had surface level information on something, and as soon as he was tested on it, he didn't know how to respond because he couldn't even think of what other genders were. And I don't blame him, because I don't know what they all are either. There's like, how many are they claim? There's like 60 or 70 or 90. I don't know what they are, but I don't believe that, so I don't care. And it's not important for my worldview that I know that information. Where it was kind of an awkward moment then for the got embarrassing pretty quickly.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of a Red Deer conference I went to where Chris Rufo was speaking, and he really emphasized when speaking with people on the other side of the political spectrum or challenging them in any way, it was very important, he said, to question them, to really understand whether they even believe what they're saying, which is essentially what Poilievre did in this instance with the reporter. It's like, okay, well, what do you actually know about what you're asking me? Anyways, I also read through the executive order that Donald Trump signed regarding the genders, where he essentially said that the government would only recognize man and woman. And we saw NDP leader in Canada, Jagmeet Singh, comment on this, saying that Canada could become a safe haven for transgender people. Let's watch that clip now.
Should Canada amend the Safe Third Country Agreement for trans Americans who come to our borders seeking refuge?
On that note, I think it's really sad for the folks in the States right now that heard the president basically say that they don't exist, or that their reality or their identity is no longer recognized. It's really scary for a lot of folks. And I just want to acknowledge how scary that must be for people who heard that, who now feel really alone, who feel really afraid. I think what Canada's always done is shown as a country that we are there for people when they're in their times of need. That's something that's been a point of pride of Canada. So looking at the third country, that agreement and how we can amend it, it's been something that we've been considering for a while. We've raised concerns about the agreement for a while. And so it's something we'll look at.
Yeah, so what do you guys think of what Singh had to say there, especially if, say, what he's alluding to actually occurred and transgender people started flocking here from the United States with the existing border concerns and the existing immigration concerns? I mean, how does this kind of play into that?
Well, they do this all the time, right? Like they will say Canada, people are going to flee the United States to Canada. They did it with the Supreme Court ruling on abortion laws in the United States. They were claiming, all these women are going to come to Canada to seek abortions, right? But it's just, they don't view this clearly, as I've been saying. Like they have a totally distorted understanding of what is really happening. And the fact is, the United States, it is safe to be transgender. It is safe to be gay. It is safe to be a lesbian. It is safe to be, an immigrant. It's not a country where there's religious persecution. There isn't, race persecution. It has a history of slavery, yes, but there is no slavery in the United States anymore. It is a free country. It is the freest country in the world by objective standards. And to say that Canada will somehow become this place where people are fleeing the United States is ridiculous, because there's no reason to flee. It's admitting that there are two biological genders is not, persecution. It's just a statement of fact. It's like getting angry and upset at somebody saying the sky is blue.
Yeah, very simple. We actually don't need any more people in this country right now. We certainly don't need any more people with mental illness in this country. And I can tell you right now that if you come, you're going to have healthcare needs, especially if you're transgender. You're always in and out of the hospital. if you're actually getting those surgeries and stuff, and you're going to find it a lot worse off here than in Canada, than in the States, because you simply wouldn't be able to get the treatment that you need. So just stay in the States. Don't listen to Jagmeet Singh. He's not actually that relevant here. You might think he is because he holds political office, but trust me, he's far less relevant than he seems, and he certainly does not hold a lot of political sway. So probably just, let that one go on by you.
And just to talk about Jagmeet Singh's relevance, I completely forgot this guy existed in the last few months. He has not contributed anything. His ability to take advantage of the political situation, you would think the NDP would be coming out on top of this as the only legitimate left-wing alternative to the Liberals, but they're not. They've totally fumbled a golden opportunity because of Jagmeet Singh. He is just nobody likes him, and he's dragged his own party from a position of relative power to being completely irrelevant. He literally had the say over what the Liberal government was doing, and his consistent support of the Liberals in non-confidence votes and propping them up for years has cost him and his party's complete political future, essentially. I totally blame him, and I think the NDP should be asking themselves, do we want to keep this guy around for much longer? Because it hasn't been an uphill ride for them at all.
Yeah, we've seen in looking at the historical polling and kind of the downfall of the Liberal government, instead of the NDP taking those seats from the Liberals, they have fallen as well alongside them, and all the seats have gone to the Conservatives. In fact, I was looking at the seat distribution polls on 338 Canada just yesterday, and I think the NDP were in fourth place behind the Bloc and the Liberals, because the Bloc would win so many seats in Quebec. So I mean, they're nowhere near becoming a governing party. We'll all remember Jagmeet Singh said he was going to be the next Prime Minister of Canada, but that doesn't seem to be the case in any sense. Cosmin, what's going on with the carbon tax? We're seeing a lot of historical proponents of the carbon tax now back away from it in light of the leadership election. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so Steven Guilbeault, the environment minister, essentially said he's open to replacing the consumer side of the carbon tax with a different mechanism. Now, he hasn't provided any specifics. He hasn't, is it just going to be another rebranding like the Liberals did, but with the carbon rebate? Like, what is he talking about? I'm not so sure I 100% believe him. But we have a clip of him announcing that right now.
Do you know what he's going to do? Have you been briefed on the specifics of his plan? And do you think it can be an effective replacement for the consumer carbon tax?
The short answer to your question is yes. I have spoken with him, and I'm confident that by working together with other members of the Liberal caucus and membership, we can come up with a plan that will ensure that Canada achieves its climate goals. And again, he's incredibly knowledgeable. I have great respect for everything he's done, but also his vision and understanding of this issue, which really very few people in the world can say they've done as much as he has and understand this issue.
And so Guilbeault additionally also supported Mark Carney's plan for the carbon tax, and Mark Carney has also indicated support for removing the consumer aspect of the carbon tax. But from my understanding, the corporate carbon tax would still remain. It would still impact businesses. How genuine do you take this? Like, is Guilbeault being genuine here? Are the Liberal leadership candidates being genuine, Rachel?
I don't think so. I think they realize that the carbon tax has become extremely unpopular, and it's really untenable to run on that in this current climate, especially with the Conservatives really having made that their issue. And so we've seen the front runners for the Liberal leadership race come out and say, oh, we're not going to do the consumer carbon tax. We might look at a different plan. I wouldn't trust them as far as I can throw them. I think that if they were to be elected, we'd see them come forward shortly with a plan to make life very difficult for Canadians. At the same time, I think that the Conservatives need to get serious and realize that this is probably not going to be a carbon tax election as they have pinpointed it to be. And they are going to need to do some serious rebranding very quickly to discover what their new pitch, because there really needs, what's the question of the election? What is the issue that's top of everyone's mind? Because I don't think it's going to be the carbon tax. And we haven't seen the Conservatives make that pivot yet.
And you bring up a really good point, Rachel, that I'm going to throw to you, Isaac. Has this opened up the Conservatives to, is this a weak point for them? Because Pierre Poilievre has been running on the idea that the next election will be a ticket on the carbon tax. Voters will be specifically asking themselves about the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau. And that's no longer the case, obviously. Justin Trudeau will not be running for prime minister in the next election. It will either be Carney or Freeland. So how much has this opened up the Conservatives to a certain political vulnerability in the way that they conduct the next campaign a few months out from a potential election this spring?
Yeah, I think, Canadians across the nation have been wondering that. And if I recall, I think Poilievre was interviewed yesterday and they kind of asked him a question along the same lines, like, how do you pivot away from the carbon tax now that all the Liberals are against it? And I don't know that he necessarily insinuated that he was willing to do that. He's kind of, if he were to stick with the carbon tax, of course, he's going to talk about how the Liberals are lying about the carbon tax. For example, we haven't mentioned that Freeland has also stepped away from the carbon tax, and Poilievre actually put out a statement on her today saying it's Freeland versus Freeland, because everything she's saying now is the exact opposite of what she was saying just a few weeks or months ago. So it's really a battle of the Liberals versus themselves in terms of public opinion, because we're seeing them try and distance themselves from things that the public clearly disapprove of and dislike based on polls. But of course, the Liberals themselves are the ones who implemented these very policies. So it's hard to, and Harper talked about this in his interview last week too. He said where the Liberals were really in an untenable position because the candidates of the leadership election would have to run on the Liberal Party's platform, which Canadians are done with. But now we're seeing these very candidates try and pretend or distance themselves from the platform altogether. So it's a really weird phenomenon wherein the candidates of the party are trying not to associate with the party's policies. It's really, it's just compelling, isn't it?
Yeah, and it just brought to mind, I'll point to my province that I live in British Columbia. In the last provincial election, just a few months ago, Premier David Eby said that he would be willing to do away with this province's carbon tax if the federal government changes direction on it or removes the requirement. Now, British Columbia is actually not under the federal pricing scheme. They have their own carbon tax, so they could get rid of it whenever they wanted, and then they would get slapped with the federal carbon tax. But I just bring that up because now Eby has a coalition with the Greens, and there's been no indication that he's going to follow through on that promise. And we have another election on the federal level where the candidates that are likely to replace Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are making a similar promise at the federal level to remove this requirement, at least for consumers. How much, I know I asked this, but is this just political posturing? Are they just making false promises to Canadians? And how much will Canadians buy that? Or I think that trust has been lost to some degree. And I just don't see Canadians falling for a false promise. And you touched on that, Rachel, but I'll throw it to either of you.
Yeah, just quick. Talk is cheap. And this just reminded me quickly of the recent policies we saw almost implemented there by the Liberals in regard to the tax break. And I just remember reading the polls on this, and it's like they're trying to give Canadians these tax breaks, which are working against them as a party, because Canadians in these polls were saying that these policies the Liberals were implementing would make them less likely to support the party in the future, not more likely. So the policies you're trying to implement to save your party at the last minute are actually pushing Canadians further away. And I think this whole backstepping on the carbon tax could cause a similar pushing away of Canadians, because it's like, well, we know that you're just saying these things, but we might not trust that you'll actually follow through on what you're saying.
I think that voters are fickle. I think that given that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced his intention to resign when a new leader is selected, the margin that we saw, the Conservatives were kind of running away with things, it looked like. I think we'll see that gap narrow. I think that we'll have a real election. Campaigns really do matter. What the Conservatives do in a general election campaign is going to have a big impact on the outcome of the election. I think depending on who the Liberals select as their next leader will also greatly impact the election. Chrystia Freeland is going to have a much harder time distancing herself from Justin Trudeau than Mark Carney is. Sure, Mark Carney was an advisor, but he wasn't the one being tromped out there every other week to make announcements that hurt Canadians. He's not the one who's been pictured with Justin Trudeau for the last number of years. He wasn't Justin Trudeau's right-hand man like Chrystia Freeland was. So Chrystia Freeland going to be a lot easier to tie her to that disastrous record than it is for Mark Carney. So I think it's going to be a real election. I don't know that the Conservatives are going to run away with it. Something that Stephen Harper also recently said in that public interview that he did is he said the thing that Canadians are really angry at Justin Trudeau for is actually the number one issue isn't the economy. It's that we've lost our culture. Under Justin Trudeau, Canada has lost its culture and Canadians don't know what Canada is anymore. I don't know. I can't speak for anyone else, but that absolutely rings true for me. I am angry that we've lost our culture. I am angry that Justin Trudeau has described Canada as a post-national state with no identity. Now that, of course, Donald Trump wants to claim Canada, it turns out he didn't actually mean that. But I think that this election should be one of Canadian culture and identity, especially because we've seen Canadians drastically turn against the high number of immigration. Okay, well, Canadians haven't turned against immigration because they're racist. It's because they care about their culture and because we're seeing it being eroded. And I think that's what the election issue should be.
But do you, I'm just curious to ask quick, Rachel, do you think Poilievre will, do you think he'll make it about immigration? Because we've seen how reluctant he is to talk about immigration in the past. I
don't think he'll make it about immigration because there's so many videos of him in the past few years pushing for more immigration, calling to stop the deportation, saying that more students needed to get visas and then needed to get a pathway to citizenship. So it would be a very difficult path for him to do at this point. Now, you can always say, you've changed your mind, you've changed your ways, you see new information. It can be done, but I don't suspect that the Conservatives will make that the election question. As of right now, it seems like they're sticking with the carbon tax, but I do believe they are going to have to pivot from that at some point.
Okay, good to know. Well, that pretty much wraps up our stories for the week. Everything you've heard today has been off the record. Cool. Yeah.
My son woke up about 10 minutes into that. I'm pretty pissed.
I didn't hear him at all.
Well, he's a few rooms over, so.
I was like, well, that noise suppression these days is getting pretty good,
I don't think it's not that good. I need some in this room.
I don't think Wave actually has any such device. But like on Zoom and stuff and other apps, it's pretty insane what the noise suppression is capable of.
I feel like for little kids, they should make a helmet where you can turn the volume down a little bit. Like not mute them, but just like kind of turn the volume down a few.
Like when you're in bed and like the monitor goes off and you're like, a few more minutes, just gonna turn that down for a little longer.
Yeah, my ex-girlfriend had a friend who was hard of hearing, and she could adjust the volume in her ears or whatever with something. And I always kind of was jealous of that. I was like, man, you could really just turn off your hearing if you don't want to listen to something.
My Opa does that, but he often will just like pretend not to hear things. I feel like when he doesn't feel like talking about them.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I gotta hop off.
Thanks.
Yeah.
See ya.